to the house that he grew up on St. Clarence Avenue, which is close to Bloor Lansdowne, during the post-war period, after his parents had been released from the internment and the family had migrated to various places, such as Verdun and Montreal, I believe, and they were in Portland, Oregon for a time, and then they came to Toronto. And my father, during the period that his mother was dying, became very interested in that whole sort of internment period, but also the post-war period of his childhood that she'd always been very reluctant to talk about. And so while he was kind of prodding her and kind of interviewing her, which is one of the things that I deal with in my memoir, he was trying to sort of pin down what happened back then. He asked me one afternoon if I would like to sort of see where he grew up. And I said, yes, I'd be fascinated. So we drove to this house on St. Clarence Avenue, which had been a boarding house during that post-war period. My grandmother had turned it into a boarding house to try and sort of make ends meet. And the owner of the house saw my father and I standing outside on the sidewalk. And she came out onto the balcony and then asked us if we'd like to come in after he had said that he grew up there. And so going into that house and just sort of hearing my father muse and reflect on some memories, many of them quite dark, it seemed to me. Like in the front hallway, he mentioned remembering his father and his uncle getting into a fist fight, and the house was quite sort of dark and shadowy and not very well maintained, but a very sort of interesting house. And the woman, Mrs. Kutsukake, who owns the house now, said that her mother had bought it from my great-grandmother, I guess, because I think the house was in her name. And so just sort of visiting that space was very kind of inspirational for me. It kind of, that memory of visiting the house, it seemed to kind of give me some imaginative access to these collective memories that I was, of course, you know, largely inventing to some extent. I mean, drawing on things that family members had told me, but also giving my imagination free rein to kind of, you know, flesh out these characters in my imagination. And I think through that experience, I became quite interested in my grandparents' relationship and my grandmother as a sort of literary, a sort of springboard for a literary character.
I like this idea of filling in the gaps. I think that all of us are trying to do that. And I think that particularly with the Japanese Canadian community, there were huge gaps that needed to be filled in, especially for our generation. When I was writing my novel, I had this idea of one character who would be Japanese Canadian and would be sent back, you know, sent to Japan, not back. She was born in Canada. But while I was writing it, this opportunity came up just out of the blue that there would be a tour of the internment camps. It was a bus tour that was advertised in the Nikkei Voice, the Japanese Canadian newspaper. And so I thought, well, this is my only chance. I've got to take it. So I signed up for the tour and I went. And before I went, I thought, oh, well, you know, I wasn't intending actually to have any scenes of that area. But after I went, I realized that I was so moved by seeing the landscape, seeing that whole Slocan Valley, that, you know, I'd heard these names as a kid, you know, Slocan, Lemon Creek, Papa, you know, all these sort of funny names. New Denver, they all seem like such a mishmash of names. And to finally go there and just see it in person was actually very inspiring, especially to see the landscape, which is so extraordinarily beautiful. The nature is, it's really breathtaking. And then you think about, you know, what was happening, what was there, how people had been interned there. And that sort of physical landscape, I realized actually meant a great deal to me. And I wondered, well, it took me a long time to get there, to see it. You know, I went in 2010, you know? Well, of course, no one in my family would ever have gone that. Nobody would have done that anyway. But it's interesting that it took me that long to actually go there, and it was partly because I was writing this book. And although I didn't think that I needed to do research there, somehow I felt a kind of obligation. Well, you know, how can I write about this? I haven't even been there myself. So I went, and it was, as I said, deeply moving. Of course, the New Denver Nikkei Memorial, what is it called? The Nikkei, the internment camp, the recreated internment camp site with the shacks that have been recreated to the exact measurements of what was there, and the kind of things that people had in these tiny dwellings. That was, of course, you know, extremely interesting, and I learned a lot from that, and it was extremely moving. But also moving was going to these places where there's nothing. There's no trace. It's like woods, you know? And of course, you know, you realize that, of course, it's to the government's advantage not to have anything there, to have no memories at all. It's just all completely wiped out.
That's really interesting. I mean, having read your novel, it's wonderful. But so much of the action actually takes place in Japan, in the novel. And so that made me think too, you know, if we've got this country, Japan, right, which perhaps sometimes inconveniently, right, exists over there. And things are happening in Japan, and people's attitudes towards Japan are changing. So, you know, now Japan is kawaiso, is kind of sad because, you know, the tsunami and all that, and the financial meltdown, and now China is the demon, right? A generation ago, Japan was the demon, and China was worthy of our support. So this flips back and forth. So Japan is seen in positive or negative light. The politics within Japan, especially dealing around issues that involve the war, are still roiling because they've never been resolved. But at the same time, of course, I think with all immigrant communities in Canada, it's the same sort of thing. As each generation moves away from that source, it becomes less of a kind of, well, even from the beginning perhaps, of a reality and more of something which is constructed or imagined. And so, but at the same time, for all of you, it seems that Japan, in some respects or other, does play a role. Right? And so I'm interested in how you use it, what that role is, how you relate to this country over there, which is on the other side of the world, and for many people outside our land.
Well, I always marvel at the power of Japan on certain generations, certainly the first generation of Japanese Canadians, but as well it filtered into the second generation. I mean, my best friend, his father told me, quite honestly, that he thought Japan would win the war in 6 months. You're in camp, right? And he said, yeah, I was in camp, but I thought for sure that we would be liberated. And he held by that, you know, throughout the war. And I thought, what kind of hold does Japan have on these people? And it's fascinating. It's fascinating. As I told you, right, at the end of the Second World War, a lot of prisoners didn't believe Hiroshima actually happened. It was the lie of Hiroshima. They didn't believe that the emperor actually talked to the people on the radio. That was an actor. There's no way that the real emperor would do that. And deny that he was a god on top of that. And they held that for the longest time. Just amazing. Anyway.
Japan, I've had such an evolving, ambivalent relationship with Japan. One is like, you know, a longed-for homeland, and you know, I think in some ways my whole life has been a search to find what that homeland is, and to find out, you know, I thought, oh, maybe it's Hawaii. You know, Japanese American culture, because the Japanese there remained, and so there are there's a physical community there, and Japanese Sunstates grew up with so much more culture, and a really authentic, evolving Japanese American culture. And you sort of see a bit more in California than LA or whatever. But anyway, but Japan itself, so this, you know, it's a weird thing to go there and not have the language and not have that access. But, you know, to say, first you have the shock of the familiar, like, wow, everybody looks like me, you know, this is good. But, you know, this was also a long time ago, because now you can feel that way walking around Toronto. So there's so many Asians. But the shock of the familiar, and then the differences become clearly very profoundly manifest to you, right? Like it's really different, and to carry the history that they carry, to think of ruled by an emperor, and you know, to grow up with that kind of belief in a divine emperor, and then to be part of a country that is, you know, that's been devastated by an atomic bomb, but has committed really horrible atrocities. And I've always been interested in Jewish diasporic literature, Israeli literature, and German literature, because of the sort of parallels around that, around being both a victim and a perpetrator. And there's all this stuff that's coming out now in Japan, and you know, I think for Niseis, it's hard to think of Japan in a negative way. They don't really want to face it as a country that they have some relationship to, or they're in some way part of, and they carry this history of